one of the things that we love about these evenings is that actually it's not about coming with a polished thesis. It's more about what are some of the questions that you are engaged with presently. So I guess why don't we start there? What are some of the questions that you're wrestling with in life, in ministry, as you look at the world currently?
Well, and I guess I'm pleased for a start that you're not expecting anything polished. So, that takes away a weight of expectation. So I think life is made of so many questions, whether it's the ones that kids ask us or the ones that we ask ourselves or the world asks us. And one that I've been constantly wrestling with is one of identity. And I remember attending an interview once a few years ago. And one of the questions I was asked was, what do you think might be the leading theological question that a church might need to wrestle with in the future? And I felt that the question of identity would be one of the key ones, whether it is around a question of human sexuality, question of national autonomy, questions of gender, of racial justice, and so on. And so for me, it's a question that locates itself essentially around issues of ethnicity and how I'm, as a Christian, invited to inhabit that fracture. And I'm often puzzled by the fact that all of us kind of subscribe to the fact that ethnicity or race is a social construct, and yet we invest so much of the way in which we live in labels and ideologies that ultimately rest on very little. And I guess for me, the challenge is how do I make sense of those questions of identity in a way in which they are invested and lodged within my own body, my own existence? How do I allow them to resonate with some of my theological aspiration and a vision of the world that I think is one that names difference, but not as a source of fracture, but as a mark of an expression of God's kind of exuberance in creation, and how do I hold that intention, recognizing also the lived reality of fracture that those very notions are creating between us. And you mentioned earlier my very sexy job title, and and part of the work that I try to do is to help our church context here in Leicester to reflect around what it means actually to have a lived experience of a church that is fractured along ethnic and racial and cultural lines. What does it mean for us to build church that, as Martin Luther King suggested, that are segregated and seem to live quite happily with the notion of segregation? And I don't know about your context, but when you look around most churches, not just in this country, but globally, there's a sense that, especially in areas where there's some ethnic disparity and diversity, there's a sense that the default expression of the church is segregation along ethnic, cultural, and racial lines. And for me, that there is then that vision of a world created plural on the one hand, but also when you look at the other end of the arc, that vision of humanity gathered in worship before God. And then in the middle, the picture that we're inhabiting seems to be very dissonant with those two realities. So how do we inhabit that space with authenticity, with integrity, redeeming something about the way in which we've used difference as a marker of worth, and worth that is not equally distributed, but also difference as a vehicle for separation and fracture. So that's a question that I wrestled with.
As you were talking, it strikes me that part of the grappling there is it's from how you're talking, almost an inward grapple as much as it is an outward grapple. And I obviously would like to talk a bit more about that outward in a little while, but I'm really intrigued for you, Lusa. what is going on with those questions of identity inwardly, not that that they're not related to the outward.
Yeah, I think some of it is rooted in my biography, and I often argue with others that every theology is biography. So all of our discourse about God, all of our quest around about God is rooted in our story. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there is something about having lived life on the move. Even within my own country, I never lived longer than a year in the place where I was born. Wow. And so moved within my country, in different countries. And we were joking with my kids recently about changing schools. And I was telling them, well, I did primary school in 4 countries and in about 5 different schools. But that also kind of raises the sense of anchoring. So what is my anchoring? Where do I find belonging? Where is home for me? And I love that there's this beautiful word of an Egyptian writer, I think it's Nakib Mahfouz, who writes about home and says, home is not where we were born. I'm sort of misquoting him. Home is not where we were born, but it's where all our attempts to escape cease. And I don't feel that I have found that place where my attempts to escape cease. And I'm still on a quest to find that place where I can fully belong and be me in a way that is not expected to assimilate, expected to adjust, or expected to justify and explain my being there. And again, I mean, your question initially was around how kind of infleshed that reality is. Yes. And for me, I'll probably share something very, very intimate and personal, and please take it with the generosity that you can. So at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, I suddenly was awakened to the reality that for years I had carried trauma that was induced by racial abuse. And I didn't know that I had integrated that trauma within me. And it manifested in making me physically ill. And it's only when I started naming that and engaging with that, I started recognizing that actually when we talk about issues of racism, issues of exclusion, we often think of them as incidents that are external to our beings, or concepts, or even ideologies that are conceptual. But for me, there is something about how the lived reality of fracture lodged itself within the deepest recesses of our bodies. And there is something, I guess, if we try to think theologically, it takes us to start reflecting around actually what might the incarnation of Christ have to say to those reality of fracture that is not just an external experience, but one that is deeply written within ourselves, within our stories.
And as you reflected on that, that kind of sense of the incarnation, given a lens for that, but it's more than a lens, isn't it? I guess it is the enfleshment almost within you.
Yeah.
How is that worked out on a day-to-day for you? Because yeah, I mean, it strikes me. I love. It's really helpful to hear that you've moved so much, and that questions of home naturally kind of are sparked by that. And I'm really intrigued as to the kind of sense of trauma that you've experienced and potentially will experience and continue to experience in different ways. How Christ is found within that.
Yeah, I mean, this soon would be. I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to attending Carol services, and I'm looking forward to hear the reading of the first chapter of John's Gospel, and that beautiful picture of Jesus kind of indwelling, human spaces, human experience, and it seems to me, it is not just a translation, so a moving into a space, but it is really an intentional movement that is aimed to redeem and transform. And so for me, there is something about the reality of fracture, even when named, that compels us to start thinking not just about how we name and expose it, which I think is perhaps the limit of cancel culture, for instance, which has the capacity of naming the fracture, naming the abuse, naming the pain, but does not have the capacity of redeeming that pain, redeeming that fracture and transforming it. And so for me personally, it is that sense that actually, as I recognize the pain and the fracture, as I recognize the abuse and name it and call it out, and perhaps even point a finger towards a potential abuser, how do I move beyond that entanglement where we only define ourselves in a binary way, in a polarized way? And for me, there's something about the word becoming flesh, and therefore entering a space that was under the rule, in John's language, of darkness, but darkness could not either comprehend or contain or conquer it. And so how might that be a lived reality for me? And so for me, it challenges me to not just think about, how do I tell my story in a way that names the pain, but how do I lean deep into the pain in order to extricate the diamond that is lodged deep within it? And as I do that, I recognize that actually that diamond is something of an authentic version of myself, one that is not defined by how I've been named and labeled by others, but how I find, in some ways, in my own journey, I find myself called by name and called by God in a way that give me a new way of naming myself to the other, and therefore recognizing that I need to name the other also in a way that brings out some of the humanity. And so practically for me, it means that I need to learn to not just engage with white people through the lens of them being oppressors, and me an oppressed, but recognize that all of us are entangled into that space of pain and abuse and trauma, and that I can't be freed from that space unless I am willing to see my white sisters and brothers be freed from the pain that sometimes they're aware of and sometimes they're totally blind to. Yeah. And so it is working intentionally at building bridges, at weaving vital, life-giving relationships, even in those places where I feel sometimes that I'd rather not want to inhabit those spaces.
Yeah. I'm struck by so many things that you said there. I'm struck by the generosity that there is in that framework that I hope pass none of us by, and your honesty, and really appreciate you being honest about that. One of the lines that you used was about leaning into pain. And I think that's an incredibly courageous, brave thing to even consider, let alone to try to embody. Just on the kind of, on the outward, the fracture lines within society where there is pain, there is a kind of disjuncture there, all that kind of stuff. How do we start to enable people in those contexts, in society, to lean into pain and to begin to then, from that position, start to see redemption happen around some of those fracture lines?
Yes, And I was talking earlier about the cancel culture, and it seems that it's a preferred mode of operation, and it's not a current thing. I think humanity has often relied on that approach, where we've got a very binary, very polarized way of looking at things. And I wonder whether sometimes it is just recognizing and gifts also that we've had from others who've done that reflection for us. And we often use the language of intersectionality, just recognizing that actually there is no one and no situation that is unique in itself. And that all of us carry multiple layers of experience, of meaning, of exclusion, or both as practitioners or victims of exclusion. And so recognizing that actually there is complexity in who we are as people, and help us of all recognizing the fact that we're not simple, we're complex beings. But also recognizing that actually there isn't just a single story that exist about either ourselves or others. And in fact, when we look at oppressive political movements, often what characterizes them is that attachment and that development of the single narrative.
Yes.
And so there is one particular story, and often it's a particular story that is attached to a particular people in a particular place. And actually, something of the movement of God at work through history and through scripture reminds us that even when there is a particular story or a particular people, it's always with the aim of reaching and impacting the whole of creation. And when that particular people fails to realize that, often things go wrong. And so how do we help people recognize that actually their story is not simple, is complex. And complexity, for me, does not equate with messiness, but it means wealth and richness. And so how do we value complexity as a gift? And therefore, how do we invite others into our complexity? And how do we become humble enough to enter into someone else's complexity? And there's then that tension between what spaces are we hosted in and what spaces are we guests in? And part of the challenge sometimes is to assume that some people are always the guests and some people are always the hosts. I mean, the drama that we've witnessed in the channel yesterday with terrible loss of life. Yeah. For me, it is just an obvious expression of a context where we've determined that some people were hosts of one space and others could only be guests in that space. And therefore, it creates fracture. It dehumanizes us all in that process. So moving from singularity to complexity, and to use kind of theological language, there's something about also the naming of the fracture. We talk about repentance, and often we use the language of lament as well. And how do we find lament not just as a space for whinging, but or a place that is a kind of cynical agnosticism or agnostic cynicism, but a place where we are really turned towards God and calling for change and transformation. And my sense is that that movement then should lead us to a place of reparation. So we can't just assume that the generosity that is offered enables us to go scot-free, as they say. So there is an element of responsibility. So if I am an inheritor of a culture that is oppressive, then in some ways I need to contribute to the process of transforming that space, and therefore not expect that the burden of responsibility should be on those who've been oppressed and excluded and marginalized, but that there is indeed a need for me to take some responsibility towards reparation. And biblically, they also use the language of retribution. And when you look at the language of sacrifice in the Bible, that was when reparation and retribution were often referenced to. It led to a place of reconciliation. And so my sense is that jumping from the naming of the fracture to reconciliation without doing the work of repentance, lament, and reparation is impossible. So we need to go through all those cycles, through all those processes. And only then are we able to enter that space of reconciliation and reconciliation for me, it's really the opportunity of telling afresh our story in a relational way, in a way that enables the other to flourish, as I am enabled to flourish as well.
Yeah, so in some ways, there's an incredible amount of hospitality within that.
Absolutely.
That becomes the. I'm really interested in the stuff around complexity that you're talking about and naming it, because actually sometimes it's really, when something is complex, it's difficult to be able to pin down because it is a multi-leveled, multi-layered. I often think of it as a bit like a spider's web. Of different things that are going on. What's helped you in your work within Leicester or in other places to actually be able to say, right, I'm going to name parts of this complexity?
I think there are two or three things that I want to say. One is that there is an initial internal process that needs to happen. I was talking earlier about leaning into the discomfort, and that in many ways come from some ancient spiritual practices. I think it's often referred to as equanimity, which is a commitment not just to try and resolve the questions, I guess, which is what you're doing here. It isn't about resolving the questions, but it's recognizing that the questions are an invitation, an opportunity to deepen understanding. And with understanding comes the opportunity to give meaning as well. And so for me, there is something about actually an initial individual process of discovery, or we might even speak of conversion, of transformation.
We're allowed to.
Yeah. and there is also the sense that actually I need then, once I've opened myself to my inner world, how do I open myself to the outer world and allow others' voices, others' wisdom to speak into my life? And what I've found really helpful is reading or engaging with work that others have done on similar issues, enabling them to teach me a new language, to express sometimes things that I feel intuitively and that I kind of lodge within me, but I don't have the way to express them. But they're able to give me the new language to articulate some of that. And that language is sometimes literally words, but sometimes it is also just practices and habits. How I posture myself and I position myself in respect to the other. And one of the questions I often ask myself is, whose table do I sit at as a guest? And who sits at my table as a guest? It's a simple everyday experience. But what I find is that I am very selective. And so I need to start asking myself and questioning myself, why is it that I only have a certain type of people at my table? Why is it that I'm only allowing a certain type of voices in my life? And the challenge, therefore, is not to say, is not to try and resolve the question and understand why I'm doing that, is to move towards commitment of saying, actually, I will change my practice, I will change my habit so that I will sit at a table where someone else is a host, and someone whose experience of life is radically different to mine. I will make an effort to read a book of somebody whose views are radically different to mine. I will try to nurture friendships and relationships with people that repulse me or frighten me. And I must admit that I'm not always successful at it. But the more I expose myself to that, the more I build some sort of emotional muscle memory. That means that it becomes a bit easier every time I find myself into that place.
I love that emotional muscle memory. I also love the thought with your impending role of asking the question, whose table do I sit at? And who sits at my table? I think that I was thinking, that will be. I'm really excited to see what that will mean for Willesden in the next 2 or 3 years, and what that will mean for you as well. And I guess one of the things that really strikes me about some of the work you've been trying to do in the Leicester Diocese is about, in some ways, creating places where some of this is not just something that Lusa's doing, but it's kind of embodied in a community. It's lived out between people. And I wonder if you could just maybe give us a few instances of where you're seeing the kind of spaces, safe spaces, the last more question and answers with Jamie Rees, we talk about brave spaces, where actually some of those fault lines, some of the fractures are front and center in some ways, and yet there's a path towards reparation, repentance, reparation, and then reconciliation. I just wonder if you wanted to give us some examples of some of the work that's going on.
Yeah. Well, I probably want to preface whatever I say by saying that we feel that in our context we're barely starting the conversation, and there's often the risk to try and kind of beautify the story beyond what it really is. But I think there's been a gift in us journeying through this process of wanting to become intercultural churches, intercultural worshiping communities, communities that are intentional in creating space where each other's voice and stories are shared, but also where we kind of name some of those fractures. So some of the kind of the early shoots and the green shoots that are emerging are, for instance, the fact that as a diocese for a number of years, we probably, I don't think we had any person of global majority heritage who had the confidence of offering themselves to exploring lay or ordained ministry. Wow. And in the past few years, we've seen an increase in the number of people of global majority heritage who suddenly are choosing not to sit marginally in our shared community, but are willing to offer themselves because they feel that the mood music has changed. And we were talking about the quest for home. And so we're not just looking behind our shoulders or looking towards the door and waiting for the exit to open up so that we can rush out. There's a sense that we want to walk deeper into the life of the church and participate fully in the life of the church. So this is one element. I think it's been quite powerful to see how in some of the church contexts, they've really wrestled, particularly with issues of racial justice. And the way some have done that was to get together and read a book together, or just have open conversations. And sometimes that were difficult, conversation that sometimes needed mediating and facilitating, because it's never an easy place to be. And so that has been encouraging to see people actually making the commitment of sitting together and wrestling together with some of those issues. I think that there is also my sense of some people who've started thinking beyond just the context of the church and saying, actually, this is not just a lived reality within our context. It is affecting the wider world, the wider community in which we live. So where do we see expressions of racial injustice? And how can we as a church, become active in engaging with some of those questions? And I mean, it has moved from people just, joining demonstrations to people being actively involved with organizations such as I think it's called the Black Curriculum, just looking at encouraging education institutions to review the material that they're using. And interestingly enough, for those who are involved in environmental issues, wanting to highlight the fact that there are patterns emerging where some communities are impacted more than others. And then highlighting some of the social disparities when we talk about environmental issues, but also the racial kind of roots of environmental injustice. And all of that, I think what it has done is lifted people's horizon and imaginative capacity to be able to read their world in a radically different way. And actually it has moved all of us from a place where we were trying to explain things away to transform the realities that we were wrestling with. And again, as I was saying, we are very early in that process. And my prayer is that we may be committed to walk that walk and see redemption and reconciliation be a lived reality.
Fantastic. In a minute, Anna will do some magic and send everybody into rooms. But I often ask this to people that share, what are some of the people we should be listening to in this? What are some of the books? I want to nuance that question to you, which a little bit, which is not just the people that you like because you agree with them, but actually who are some of those people we should be listening to that actually kind of might jar with our thinking that you've read? Because I'm really taken by the importance of that.
Yes. So for me as a Black man, someone like Jordan Peterson is one who stands in many ways at the antipodes of where I am. And I find him very difficult to engage with because in many ways, a lot of what he says, a lot of what he stands for, denies so much of what I feel is at the root of my pain. But I choose to engage with him because I want to understand him. And I want to discern what is the source of his pain. Well, I probably will never have a chance to engage with Jordan Peterson, but I do engage with a number of people who actually read Jordan Peterson and really buy into the narrative and the vision of the world that he offers. And so I read Jordan Peterson in conversation or rather in tension with, well, maybe in conversation with others who help me or actually speak and name things that are consonant rather with my own sense of who I am and who I aspire to be as well.